Hello and welcome to this special edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu, and once again I'm coming to you from my home just outside Washington, D.C. COVID-19 has changed the way we broadcast, and this is the new reality that we face. Russia is now seeing a spike in cases as it becomes a coronavirus hotspot. Later in the program, we'll be joined from Moscow by Russian journalist Dmitry Babich to discuss that. But we begin with the challenges facing the China-U.S. relationship as both countries respond to the pandemic. We have a great panel to discuss the implications. Joining me via Zoom from Virginia is John Sitilides. He is a geopolitical analyst and consultant to the U.S. State Department. With us too via Zoom from Beijing is Einar Tangen. He is a CGTN current affairs commentator. And also joining us via Zoom from Washington, D.C. is Max Blumenthal. He is a journalist and editor of thegrayzone.com. Welcome to all of you to the show. John, let me start off with you. The China-bashing rhetoric is getting louder every day here in Washington. We hear this rhetoric all the time. China's been accused of a COVID-19 cover-up. There are also calls for China to pay a, quote, substantial price in compensation. Why is the Trump administration, Republicans, as well as media commentators on the conservative side pushing this rhetoric so hard?
Anand, I don't know that it's simply on one side of the political spectrum. I think what you're starting to see is a larger, broader sense that there needs to be accountability out of Beijing for the initial outbreak, the way that it concealed the outbreak, that it provided inaccurate information to the World Health Organization, and then hoarded medical supplies from around the world until it finally revealed what was happening in late January. And now, of course, we've had not only 250,000 people who have died from the coronavirus around the world, but the wrecking of the American and global economies, as well as the Chinese economy. And so I think there's a matter of accountability, of transparency, and everyone working together to find out where this virus came from, how do we prevent something like this from happening again, and seeing that we have genuine cooperation among all countries, especially between the U.S. and China, if the countries can move in that direction, which right now I think remains very doubtful in the short term.
John, you say China delayed the announcement, but I'm looking at some dates here. China first noticed that there was this virus in mid-December. Then the WHO was informed on December 31st. On January 3rd, the CDC was informed. The genome was fully sequenced and published on January 11th. And the Wuhan lockdown took place on January 23rd.
And we still don't know where the exact original location of this virus is. Was it the Wuhan Institute of Virology? Was it a wet market? When CDC and other US and European officials sought to enter China to work with the Chinese government to find out how this began, they were denied entry. The market was bleached clean, and we still don't know if there's a cleanup job happening at the laboratory. So there have been some steps that have been taken, but China has an absolute legal obligation as a member of the World Health Organization to provide all information as quickly as possible to be able to warn the international community of a viral outbreak. It failed to do so for 6 weeks.
All right, let me get a response from Einar Tangen. He's in Beijing. Einar, we just heard there that China needs to be held accountable, that it had hoarded medicines, that it didn't tell the world about this virus in time. What's your response?
Well, I would go back to what you just said. I mean, John did not respond to your timeline. He basically created another one. And this is the kind of talking points that the the Trump administration is putting out. It's right out of the O'Donnell playbook. Don't defend what the U.S. has done. Don't even talk about the negligence, but simply go after China and say that there's a doubt. Now, it's pretty rich coming from John. He's saying that China has an absolute obligation under WHO when the U.S. has just defunded it and said that it's a mouthpiece for China. I mean, this is the kind of doublespeak that you would expect coming out of Washington, but it doesn't have any kind of real substance. This idea that you don't know does not mean that you can therefore make up facts the way you want to. So it's important to stick to what we actually know, the dates, what was disclosed, instead of just making up this kind of nonsensical rhetoric.
John, a very quick response from you.
Yes, if I might. The assumption here is that we must take at face value everything that's been pronounced by the Chinese government. there's been no ability to independently confirm or verify any of the information that has come from Beijing or that has been communicated to the World Health Organization and at what time. And that lack of cooperation on the part of Beijing is, I think, what's lending to not just an American sense of distrust, but you see it playing out now throughout the European Union.
But John, I just gave you those dates. December 31st, the WHO was informed. January 3rd, the CDC here in the United States was told about it.
When American and European officials sought to respond to some of the initial communications to work with the Chinese to figure out what had happened, Beijing slammed the door on them. This is not the way the World Health Organization is supposed to be coordinated. It's supposed to be a partnership between companies, and we saw the complete lack of accountability and of transparency by Beijing, which unfortunately continues to this day.
Okay, let me bring Max Blumenthal in. Max, we're seeing headlines in newspapers and television stations across the world warning of a new Cold War that's emerging between the United States and China. What are the risks of this worsening tensions between these two countries?
Well, we're seeing an example of it right now in this conversation. As John recites State Department talking points that are being handed down by Mike Pompeo. I think it's important to note that U.S. officials have in fact confirmed being alerted by their Chinese counterparts. And I think it was December 31st when CDC Director Robert Redfield, who's a close ally of Donald Trump, received a call from his counterpart in China, the director of the Chinese CDC, who was crying on the phone about the fear of this epidemic and trying to warn the Americans. And then on January 3rd, it was Alex Azar, the director of the Health and Human Services Department, who was notified by the World Health Organization, which had been notified by the Chinese CDC. And, you know, the rhetoric we're hearing from the State Department is actually at odds with the language we heard from Donald Trump in January, who was praising the response of China while the rest of U.S. media was attacking it for its authoritarian response. And of course, Trump was saying everything's going to be fine in the U.S. Well, now that everything is not fine and we're getting up to 70,000 deaths where states are unable to get PPE for nurses and first responders, the Trump administration, through Mike Pompeo, extreme militarist, is pointing the finger at China to deflect blame. And this is extremely dangerous. It feeds into a sort of a pivot to Asia on steroids that the Trump administration obviously aims to execute, as well as hostility and kind of proxy warfare across the globe from Africa to South America, where the U.S. is lashing out at countries that are forming alliances with China through the Belt and Road. So ultimately, the new Cold War will lead to enhanced conflict. It could become at some point a hot war. But in the near term, what it's doing is it's cutting off the kind of communication and medical cooperation we need to stamp out this pandemic. The U.S. government should be asking for Chinese doctors to come to our cities to consult with U.S. doctors and provide them with the experience that they gathered in taking this epidemic down in Wuhan.
Okay. John, there is another explanation for this, and we are hearing this from many commentators here in the United States who say that, look, the United States is scapegoating China here because of its own shortcomings in addressing this crisis, because of its very slow and inadequate response to it.
All right, so let's go over a couple of things here, and I'm glad you've positioned the question the way that you have, because some of the information that went from Beijing to the WHO was completely inadequate and incomplete, such as the fact that first, it was simply bat to human transmission. And for 3 weeks, the Chinese government sat on the information that it knew that it was human to human transmission, which is one of the reasons why there was a more sanguine response, not only in Washington, but also in Brussels. And I think President Trump wanted to believe that when General Secretary Xi was communicating information to him, that it was accurate information. And that's why he seemed rather sanguine the end of January. It was only after we understood that it was human to human that the administration decided to shut down all travel for Chinese nationals to the United States. So I also want to make sure that we're not localizing this to simply a Beijing v. Washington framework. This is a global response to China's campaign. And so you're seeing this in Brussels. You're seeing major tensions now between China and Australia because Australia would simply like an investigation into the roots of this. And the Chinese instead attack Australian diplomats
Well,
and
actually,
engage in economic coercion against Australia.
John, Australia has just dismissed the allegation made by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo that he has enormous evidence that this virus originated in a laboratory in Wuhan. Australian intelligence, which has an agreement with the United States, says, no, we have seen no evidence.
So has the U.S. Director of National Intelligence. So has the U.S. Director of National Intelligence dismissed the notion that the virus was man-made.
Right. John,
nobody's talking about the virus being man-made. The issue is, did this get out in a way that it didn't need to, and to what extent were mistakes made in Beijing? That's what nobody knows. And so if Australia disagrees with Secretary Pompeo, so be it. Let's have the investigation that I think the whole world wants, especially as this virus continues to spread everywhere around the world. But we can't have an investigation unless we have cooperation from Beijing, and Beijing refuses to offer that cooperation.
All right, Anna, we are hearing these calls for an investigation. We hear it here in the United States. In fact, Australia also called for an investigation. Plus the fact that, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says he has, quote, enormous evidence, none of which we've seen. How is China countering this?
Well, quite frankly, the ambassador has said that there should be an end to this kind of decoupling and this vilification of China. Everybody understands the subtext here is that Donald Trump wants to be reelected. He doesn't have a good reason why he did nothing. Even if John's tin hat conspiracy theory is correct, what did he do the whole month of February? He was downplaying it. You say that he realized late, not until late January. Now, that contradicts his own, Trump's own narrative on this thing, that he can't explain why he did nothing for an entire month despite receiving briefings from his military, his health officials, even his closest economic advisor, Peter Navarro, was no friend to China. It was very clear and explicit that this was a serious situation. So while John might want to push these talking points for what I'd say was the O'Donnell big book coronavirus response, attack China at every instance, that's just a political game. I hope that he can see past that and understand that we're talking about real things. This is an adult conversation, not a 13-year-old trying to pass blame because he broke something and doesn't want to admit to it. The United States has the worst record of not the worst, but one of the worst records in the world. The number of dead, the number of people who have been infected, the very poor preparation, this opening up that's premature, that's going to lead to a secondary wave. And, there's this kind of, you want to talk about sanguine. I mean, Donald Trump saying, yeah, people are going to die, 3,000 a day, big deal. We'll get on with it. We don't want the cure to be worse than the curse.
Let me go back to Max. Max, I don't want to sound flippant about this, but haven't we seen this movie before, this idea of politicizing intelligence that the White House receives?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this really is the WMD of the anti-China hardliners within the Trump administration, who are led by Mike Pompeo. And at the Gray Zone, we really provided a clinical anatomy of how this deception was spread into mainstream media. I mean, it started kind of from the far right in January, didn't get anywhere, and then was sort of refashioned, fished out of the right-wing political wet market and polished off for mass consumption through a veteran neoconservative columnist in the Washington Post, Josh Rogin. And if you actually examined his article, he was using someone he described as a research scientist who in fact has no scientific credentials, is a Chinese dissident whose career is funded by the U.S. government at the National Endowment for Democracy, and was declaring that we need to know what happened in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Well, 25 scientists from across the West in a peer-reviewed journal, Nature magazine, have said that the virus was not man-made and did not escape from a lab. We saw the same at Lancet magazine with peer-reviewed scientists. We've heard the same from Anthony Fauci, but the Trump administration continues pushing Mike Pompeo has even contradicted his own director of national intelligence and been forced to pull back. Meanwhile, they're seeking to attack the World Health Organization just because it's another multilateral organization, just as they've attacked the UN, just as Mike Pompeo has threatened International Criminal Court investigators. And
Right.
well, there's one point I just want to make about the World Health Organization. It's that in 2009, when H1N1 was declared a health emergency by the WHO, after it was showed itself in California, it took the WHO 2 months to do that. It took them 1.5 months to declare COVID-19 a global pandemic. So why are they being attacked for acting too late? In the latter case, it is because they've praised China's response and because of the Trump administration's guiding hostile hand.
All right, gentlemen, we are going to have to leave it there. That was a great discussion. Thanks to all of you for being with us. We are going to take a short break right now. We'll be back to look at the situation in Russia right after that break. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.
In a world that's constantly moving, what is it that really defines us? Is it the ideas of our time or the trends that shape our lives? Full Frame, weekly on CGTN America.
CGTN, covering coronavirus. From Asia, Africa, Europe, and America. The dangers, the uncertainty, a global effort to stop the spread and save lives. For the latest updates on coronavirus, stay with CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to this special edition of The Heat. We turn our focus now to Russia. How is Russia handling the coronavirus pandemic? Joining us now from Moscow is journalist and Russia analyst Dmitry Babich. Dmitry, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Russia now is seeing something like 10,000 new cases on average every day. What is the situation and when is this pandemic expected to peak in Russia?
Well, compared to other European countries, the situation in Russia is very good, actually, because we have 155,000 cases, but so far we had only 1,500 fatalities. Just compare it to Italy, where it was, I think, about 29,000 now, close to 30,000. Roughly the same figure in Spain, 21,000 in France. Even in Germany, which is the best country in Europe fighting coronavirus, there were 7,000 fatalities. Compare them to Russia's 1,500. So statistics are not bad. But of course, the situation is dangerous, and the country has been on a standby mode for more than a month now. So of course, people are concerned. But taking into account the situation that Putin had to deal with, I mean, remember, we have the longest border in the world, and that border is with China, the former Soviet, now Russian Chinese border, which spreads to several thousand miles. So that border had been shut off earlier than all the other big countries did it. It was shut off back in January. So the virus that we have got is basically from Europe. It came with the tourists that we could not refuse to admit back into the country. It didn't come from China, as in most other countries. However, you know, I'm reading foreign press in 5 languages, and it's just, I would say, abominable how all the journalists, all the commentators, how they are longing to see Putin to fail. You know, the political angle at which this situation is viewed from outside just terrifies me. Luckily, we don't have this situation in Russia. You know, if you have reports in Russia from Italy, from Spain, from the United States, we're really terrified. We really sympathize with the people and no one writes like, is it good for the Spanish prime minister what happened? Is he going to stay in power or not? That doesn't interest us. We're interested in the fate of the people. That makes us different.
Right, that is true, Dmitry. In many countries, this has become politicized, but there in Russia, actually, your prime minister, Mikhail Mishustin, he's also been infected by the coronavirus. How's he doing?
Well, the latest reports say that he's recovering. He's working with papers at one of Moscow clinics where he is undergoing treatment. I think it was a very right message because people did not realize until recently that this was serious. You know, just like the English people realized that this was serious after Prince Charles got infected. In the same way, you know, Russians, when they saw that the second person in the country, the prime minister, who was basically put in his position by the Duma and the president just about 3 months ago, you know, the fact that he got infected, it kind of sent a very right message that no one is completely secure. And people started taking the situation a lot more seriously after Mr. Mishustin's infection. However, of course, there are many conspiracy theories. You know, some people say that he was replaced by his deputy, Andrei Belousov, for some political purpose, that this was some kind of theater. But I don't believe in it because Mr. Mishustin is relatively new in politics and he has been very active. So I don't really see any deep line intrigue there.
Okay. Now, when it comes to things like hospital beds, ventilators, protective equipment, how prepared is Russia for this pandemic?
Well, I can give you the statistics. In Europe, per 100,000 people, Russia has the highest number of hospital beds. We are second only to Germany. We have 818. Germany has 826. Of course, that number has been, you know, the so-called liberals have been trying to reduce that number during the last 20 years. In the Soviet Union, there were very strict rules. You know, the Medicare was not ideal under the Soviet Union, but there were certain norms that, you know, people were supposed to have a certain number of hospitable beds. In case of war, in case of a disaster, that has been the story since 1920s. So we came to this disaster better prepared than, say, Italy. Just to compare, Russia has 818 births per 100,000 people. In Italy, it was just 331. In Sweden, it's 254. Yeah. And I'm not boasting about our achievements in that sense, because under Putin, the number of these beds has been cut simply because there was this very wrong economic attitude to Medicare. Luckily, we didn't go all the way. You know, Georgia under President Saakashvili went all the way. You know, they reduced the number of hospital beds to a minimum because it allowed them to save money. That is a wrong attitude. This is the situation when the economy prevails over professionals. All medical professionals would tell you that you need hospital beds. Yeah, Dmitry, you should not save money on that.
Right, Dmitry, the lockdown in Russia has been extended to May 11th. How effective is the government response to this pandemic, and how are people responding to it?
Well, of course, people are irritated. Of course, small businesses are suffering. And they're suffering in the first place because small businesses do not have much, they don't have a lot of money to fall back on. You know, they are usually operating at a minimum. You know, they are usually living on the money that they earned during the last 2 or 3 weeks. And imagine what happens if your business has been closed for more than a month. But that was, I would say, a very sentimental, even philosophical problem, because Putin, in his speech to the population, he made basically about 15 or 16 speeches during the last month. It just annoys me so much when I read in the New York Times or in El País, you know, the Spanish paper, that Putin disappeared. You know, we don't hear him. He just is hiding somewhere under Moscow. No. He has been giving speeches almost every day during the last month. And in one of his best speeches about 3 days ago, he said that basically, I understand that a lot of people want to restart the economy. I understand that if we restart the economy, of course, we'll have less unemployed. For every old person who dies, we may have 100 or 200 less unemployed people. But just think about it. Think about the people that we're going to lose. These are our parents. These are our grandparents. Are you prepared to sacrifice them for economic stability? So
Dmitry,
he basically put the nation before a moral choice. And he said, economy is very important. We're going to rebuild it, but we will do it after we're sure that we did everything possible to protect the old people from death.
Right. And what kind of impact has this virus had on the Russian economy?
Of course, a very negative one. The Minister of Economic Development who spoke live on television today, Putin has these live call-ins with the government ministers almost every day. They explain what has been done, what's the situation. So the economic minister said that this month, when Russia was under lockdown, the fall in production in some regions was up to 33%. That's, of course, that's a tragedy, for small businesses. That's a tragedy for a lot of people with low incomes. But Russia still has a huge so-called sovereign funds. We have about $600 billion in sovereign funds. So this money is going to be used to make up for the losses. Unfortunately, we had two negative trends kind of overlapping. The fall in the oil prices and the lockdown of the economy. If we could deal with them separately, the impact would not have been so devastating. But of course, people understand that they're going to spend less in the next few months, maybe even a few years.
Okay, we are going to have to leave it there. Dmitry Babich, thank you so much for joining me on this special edition of The Heat.
Thank you.
And that's all we have time for, but the conversation continues online. You can find us on Twitter at CGTN America or on Facebook at facebook.com/CGTN America. I'm Anand Naidu on this special edition of The Heat. Thanks for watching.
Again, he can hold in guns.
Machine guns from police forces toward the protesters.
Were you worried about your life at that particular time?
Not at all.
Thank you very much for your time. What is your assessment of the state of the continent today?
Africa has the potential to power itself.
Excuse me.
This is a show for people who love exploring, discovering, and experiencing life stories. A diverse, rich, and beautiful land will introduce you to extraordinary people like this woman in Bolivia taking back their heritage and independence. A fantastic 14-year-old who created a bank to help kids, keeping them off the streets. Entrepreneurs who are making a real difference every day. America's Now, only on CGTN.